What if I told you that some people are living their lives completely out of order? What if the things that should happen tomorrow are reaching back to touch today, and the consequences of events are arriving before their causes? What if time itself is broken for certain individuals, and they're experiencing their future before it's supposed to exist? These aren't stories about time travel or science fiction. These are accounts from ordinary people who discovered that their lives were unfolding in the wrong sequence, where endings came before beginnings, and where knowing the future became a curse rather than a gift. Amanda Chen thought she was losing her mind when it started. She was a marketing coordinator at a mid-sized company, living a perfectly normal life until the day she received a thank you email from her boss, congratulating her on the exceptional work she'd done on the Morrison account. The problem was simple. She hadn't started the Morrison project yet. It wasn't even scheduled to begin until the following week. Amanda stared at the email, reading it over and over. Her boss specifically mentioned the creative approach she'd taken, the client's positive response, and how her innovative strategy had exceeded all expectations. He even referenced specific campaign elements that didn't exist yet. When Amanda checked her calendar, the Morrison kickoff meeting was still 4 days away. She figured it must be some kind of mistake. Maybe her boss had confused her with someone else or sent the wrong template email. But when she went to ask him about it, he looked at her strangely and said, "What do you mean? You presented the final concepts yesterday. The client loved them." Amanda had been homesick yesterday. She'd never even seen the Morrison brief. 2 days later, the normal timeline caught up. Amanda attended the kickoff meeting, received the project brief, and found herself creating exactly the campaign her boss had already thanked her for. Every creative choice she made, every strategy she developed, matched perfectly with what he'd described in that impossible email. It was as if she was following a script she'd never seen, recreating work she'd never done. But that was just the beginning. Within a week, Amanda's friends started congratulating her on her 6-month anniversary with David, a guy she'd never met. They showed her photos on social media of the two of them together at restaurants she'd never been to, wearing clothes she didn't own. The photos were definitely her, but she had no memory of David or any of these supposed dates. Amanda was still trying to process this when she actually met David 3 days later, exactly as the future had predicted. He approached her at a coffee shop, struck up a conversation, and asked her out. Everything unfolded naturally, but Amanda felt like she was playing a role she'd already performed. When David suggested the restaurant from the photos, when he made the jokes her friends had already told her about, when he wore the exact shirt she'd seen him wearing in pictures that shouldn't exist, Amanda realized she wasn't living her life forward anymore. The most terrifying incident happened 2 weeks later. Amanda found a letter in her mailbox addressed to her, in her own handwriting. The envelope was postmarked 3 days in the future. Inside was a note from herself, warning about specific events that would happen the next day. Her car would break down on Highway 15 at exactly 2:47 p.m. She'd meet a woman named Sarah at the repair shop who would offer her a ride, and she should decline because Sarah would be involved in an accident later that evening. Amanda had never written this letter. She didn't recognize the pen or the paper, but the handwriting was unmistakably hers, down to the way she crossed her T's and the specific slant of her letters. The letter contained details about her day that she hadn't planned yet, conversations she hadn't had, decisions she hadn't made. The next day played out exactly as the letter predicted. Her car died on Highway 15 at 2:47 p.m. Sarah offered her a ride at the repair shop. Amanda politely declined, remembering the warning, and called an Uber instead. That evening, she watched the local news and saw that Sarah had been in a serious accident just 3 hours after they'd met. David, meanwhile, had become an increasingly strange presence in Amanda's life. Their relationship was progressing exactly as her friends had described months before it began. He'd say things that Amanda remembered hearing about from her co-workers. He'd plan dates to places that had already appeared in those impossible photos. It was as if their entire relationship was following a predetermined script, with Amanda playing catch-up to a romance that had already happened in some other version of time. The breaking point came when Amanda received a sympathy card. It was addressed to her, signed by relatives she rarely spoke to, expressing condolences for the loss of her father. The card described a car accident on Route 9, mentioned the funeral arrangements, and offered support during her time of grief. Amanda called her father immediately. He was fine, working in his garden, planning to visit her that weekend. But the card contained specific details that chilled her to the bone. It mentioned the exact make and model of her father's car, described the intersection where the accident supposedly occurred, and even referenced the song that had been playing on his radio. These weren't generic condolences. They were detailed, personal, and specific to circumstances that didn't exist. Amanda begged her father not to drive anywhere for the next few days. She told him about the card, about the strange things that had been happening to her, about how the future seemed to be reaching backward into her present. Her father was concerned but skeptical. He had important meetings, responsibilities, a life to live. He couldn't just stop driving because of some mysterious sympathy card. 3 days later, the call came. Her father had been in an accident on Route 9, exactly as described in the card. The same intersection, the same circumstances, even the same song playing on his radio when the paramedics found him. Amanda was receiving condolences for his death before she even knew he'd been hurt. She wasn't alone in experiencing these temporal disruptions. Marcus discovered his problem when he received divorce papers in the mail, signed and notarized, finalizing the end of his marriage to a woman named Jennifer. Marcus was single. He'd been on dating apps for 6 months, hadn't had a serious relationship in over a year, and definitely wasn't married to anyone named Jennifer. But the divorce papers were official, complete with details about property division, custody arrangements for children Marcus didn't have, and references to irreconcilable differences that had apparently developed over a 3-year marriage that had never happened. 2 weeks later, Marcus met Jennifer at a friend's party. They hit it off immediately, began dating, and their relationship progressed rapidly. Within months, they were discussing marriage. Marcus felt like he was falling in love with someone he was destined to divorce, following a path toward a relationship that had already ended before it began. The divorce papers sat in his drawer like a prophecy, describing the exact reasons their future marriage would fail, the specific arguments they'd have, the precise way their love would turn to resentment. Sarah Kim experienced her timeline disruption through her 5-year-old son, Tommy. Tommy came home from kindergarten excited about graduation, showing her a certificate with his name on it from Jefferson Elementary School, class of 2035. Tommy was only 5. He wouldn't graduate elementary school for another 7 years, and he was enrolled at Washington Elementary, not Jefferson. But Tommy described the graduation ceremony in perfect detail. He named classmates Sarah had never heard of, described teachers he'd never met, and talked about the speech he'd given as class valedictorian. When Sarah contacted Jefferson Elementary to ask about the certificate, they confirmed that Tommy Kim was indeed enrolled for the coming fall semester, starting 1st grade in a program for gifted students. Sarah had never applied to Jefferson Elementary. She'd never even heard of their gifted program. But when she visited the school to clarify the confusion, they showed her Tommy's complete application, his test scores, and his acceptance letter, all in her handwriting, all with her signature, all dated 6 months in the future. These cases share a disturbing pattern. The future isn't just being predicted, it's actively reaching back to change the present. Letters are arriving before they're written, congratulations are offered before achievements occur, and consequences manifest before their causes exist. People are living their lives according to scripts they haven't written, following paths that have already been walked in some other version of time. The most unsettling aspect is how inevitable everything feels. Amanda couldn't prevent her father's accident, even with advance warning. Marcus feels powerless to avoid the divorce that's already happened. Sarah can't undo Tommy's enrollment in a school she never chose. It's as if the future is fixed, immutable, and the present is just catching up to events that have already been determined. Dr. Patricia Hayes experienced her timeline disruption through her medical practice. She began finding test results in patient files before the tests had been conducted. Blood work showing specific vitamin deficiencies, X-rays revealing fractures, diagnostic reports confirming conditions she hadn't yet examined. Initially, she assumed these were filing errors from her assistant, but the results were always perfectly accurate when the actual tests were eventually performed. The most unsettling incident involved 8-year-old Jenny Morrison, who was scheduled for routine blood work. Dr. Hayes found complete lab results in Jenny's file 3 days before the appointment, showing dangerously low iron levels and signs of a rare genetic condition. When Jenny's mother brought her in for the appointment, the child exhibited all the symptoms the premature results had indicated. The lab work, when actually performed, matched the impossible documentation exactly. 7-year-old Tyler began drawing detailed pictures of events that hadn't happened yet. His drawings showed his parents' car accident with startling accuracy, the specific intersection, the color and make of the other vehicle, even the time displayed on the dashboard clock. Tyler drew these pictures 2 days before his parents were involved in a collision that matched every detail he'd illustrated. What made Tyler's drawings even more disturbing was their emotional accuracy. He drew his mother crying in the hospital waiting room, his father's arm in a specific type of sling, and the exact arrangement of flowers in their hospital room. When the accident occurred exactly as Tyler had depicted, his parents realized their 7-year-old had somehow witnessed their future trauma before they experienced it themselves. The Postal Service became an unwitting participant in these temporal disruptions. Mail carriers began delivering letters postmarked days in the future, packages shipped tomorrow arriving today, and correspondence that hadn't been written yet appearing in mailboxes across the country. David Kim received a handwritten letter from his deceased grandmother, postmarked 3 days in the future, providing detailed advice about a job interview he hadn't scheduled yet. The letter contained information David hadn't shared with anyone. His concerns about the interview, specific questions he planned to ask, and encouragement about challenges he hadn't yet faced. When David actually attended the interview, which he scheduled after receiving the letter, every detail his grandmother had referenced came true. Corporate settings proved particularly susceptible to timeline errors. Jennifer Walsh worked as an administrative assistant and began receiving completed reports for projects that hadn't been assigned yet. Performance reviews for employees who hadn't been hired, budget approvals for expenses that hadn't been incurred, and meeting minutes from conferences that hadn't been scheduled. The reports were always completely accurate when the corresponding events eventually occurred. Budget items appeared exactly as pre-documented. New employees performed precisely as their premature reviews had predicted, and meetings unfolded according to minutes that had been filed weeks in advance. The most chilling aspect of these timeline disruptions was the complete inability to change predetermined outcomes. Amanda's father died in his car accident despite her warnings. Robert Hendricks suffered his heart attack at the exact time specified in the funeral bill. Tyler's parents were involved in their collision regardless of his detailed drawings warning them about the danger. Every attempt to alter the predetermined future seemed to actually cause it. When Amanda convinced her father to take a different route to avoid the predicted accident location, mechanical problems forced him to detour directly to the intersection where the accident occurred. When the Hendricks family tried to keep Robert home on the day of his predicted death, an emergency repair issue required him to leave the house at exactly the time that led to his fatal heart attack. Michael Rodriguez discovered his timeline error through his job as an emergency dispatcher. He began receiving 911 calls about accidents and emergencies before they happened. Callers would report incidents at specific locations with detailed descriptions of injuries and circumstances, but when emergency responders arrived at the scene, they found nothing. The actual emergencies would occur hours or days later, exactly as the premature calls had described. Michael tried reporting these anomalous calls to his supervisors, but the system showed no record of them. When he attempted to prevent the predicted emergencies by dispatching units preemptively, the disasters would simply shift to different times and locations while maintaining all their originally predicted characteristics. Children seemed particularly sensitive to these temporal disruptions, experiencing them more frequently and with greater intensity than adults. 9-year-old Sophie Martinez began having conversations with her future self during what appeared to be normal childhood play. Her parents would find her in her room, apparently playing alone, but clearly responding to another person. When they installed a baby monitor to observe Sophie's behavior, they heard both sides of the conversation. Sophie would ask questions about her upcoming school year, receive detailed answers about teachers she hadn't met yet, and learn about events that wouldn't occur for months. The other voice was distinctly Sophie's, but older, more mature, providing information about the future with startling accuracy. The technology around these timeline errors behaved in fascinating ways. Security cameras sometimes recorded events before they happened, showing empty hallways suddenly filled with people who wouldn't arrive for days. Voicemail systems received messages from the future, and email servers delivered correspondence that hadn't been composed yet. Phone networks became conduits for temporal communication. Susan Chen began receiving calls from her future self, providing warnings about upcoming problems and advice about decisions she hadn't made yet. The conversations were brief and often cryptic, but always proved accurate. When Susan tried to record these calls, the audio would be blank, despite both parties clearly communicating during the conversation. The temporal disruptions seemed to follow specific patterns. Information typically arrived 24 to 72 hours before the corresponding events occurred. The accuracy was always complete, but the format was often indirect. Funeral bills instead of death certificates, test results instead of diagnoses, drawings instead of photographs. Most disturbing was the discovery that these timeline errors were becoming more frequent. What began as isolated incidents affecting a few individuals had expanded to impact hundreds of families across multiple regions. The future was reaching back into the present with increasing frequency, creating lives where effect preceded cause, and tomorrow dictated yesterday. The implications were staggering. If the future was fixed and immutable, sending its evidence backward through time, then free will might be an illusion. People were living predetermined scripts, following paths that had already been completed in some other version of time. For those experiencing timeline errors, the question wasn't whether they could change the future. The question was whether they had any control over their lives at all, or whether they were simply actors performing in a play that had already been written, directed, and concluded. The evidence suggested that time might not be the linear progression we assume it to be. For some people, it had become a closed loop where endings shaped beginnings, where consequences created their causes, and where tomorrow's reality was more solid than today's possibilities. When the future starts arriving before the present, when death certificates precede death, and graduation papers appear before graduation, we have to ask ourselves, are we living our own lives, or are we just following the echoes of events that have already happened in some other version of reality? The timeline might be more fragile than we ever imagined, and for those caught in its errors, the future isn't something to be created, it's something that's already been completed, and they're just catching up to events that finished long before they began.